afternoon, everybody. We are just preparing for our webinar, just getting everything set up. So please bear with us for a couple of minutes and we will get started on the dot. My name is Eleni Polykrignadou and I am the co-founder of Sintali, and it is my pleasure to host this webinar with GMR today. Before we get fully started, just a couple of housekeeping notes. This webinar will be recorded and shared with you after the event. We will be taking Q&A from the audience during the panel, so please feel free to submit questions. If you're watching us from LinkedIn, please feel free to share your comments through the chat function, and we will be fed it for our great panel that we have joining us here today. We'll try to get to as many questions as possible, but if you have any questions that aren't being covered online, we will try and get to them after the event. We want this to be as interactive as possible. We have a very international panel. We are covering all ends of the globe today, from India all the way to America with a little sprinkle of Europe. So we are hopefully going to bring a lot of fresh insights, a lot of international examples, and really try and get into the nitty-gritty of our topic today. As mentioned, I'm the co-founder of Sintali. Sintali is an environmental verification body. We essentially fact-check sustainability claims, something which is very, very important to make sure they're credible. And we work in collaboration with SGS to act as a global certification provider for the EDGE Green Building Program, which was developed by IFC to transform the built environment. Now, I have the utmost pleasure today to moderate this panel with our wonderful guests, who I would like to introduce today. Gordon Faulkner, Head of Smart Airport Cities for GMR Group. Gordon is a smart city expert, city consultant, global thought leader in cities, property and infrastructure developer and investor, and he's going to give valuable insights on the benefits of sustainability can bring to real estate. We're also joined by Mr. Atif Syed, the lead of South Asia for IFC. In his current role, he leads IFC's Green Building Market Transformation Program across South Asia, the development of the green building sector through policy, voluntary standards, capacity building, and investment. And we're also joined by Mr. Srinivas Rao, who's a principal at Kritzinger & Rao. Srinivas is an architect and an urban planner with over 22 years of multidisciplinary project experience. And under his leadership, Kritzinger & Rao provides creative design services in architecture, urban design, and urban planning, and has completed projects across the globe. Now, I'd like to start this conversation with some context. As I mentioned, we have a very international panel, and we're really looking across the globe. But of course, our webinar today is hosted by GMR, based in India. So I'll give you some India-related facts about real estate, but really you can understand that real estate represents the backbone of society. In 2021, the construction sector in India alone was valued at $609 billion, with an annual average growth rate predicted to reach over 6% between 2023 and 2026. And by 2030, the real estate industry in India is expected to reach over $1 trillion and contribute 13% to India's GDP. Now, while India is one of the most rapidly growing construction markets, construction around the world is something that is at the core of our societies, as new buildings, offices, hospitals, homes are constantly coming up, particularly in the emerging world, as well as, of course, the retrofit needs that we see in the developed world as buildings constantly need upgrading. Urbanization, city growth, development, all of that puts a lot of pressure on cities, on communities, to build appropriate infrastructure and to make sure that communities are well taken care of. Now, simultaneously, across this word of construction and this notion of construction, we're hearing the words climate crisis echoing across the globe. With the rise in extreme phenomena from droughts to floods to wildfires, resilience and adaptation are equally important. And with new terminology like ESG and zero carbon becoming more and more familiar, people are trying to understand what to do and to marry these two worlds. Which really brings us to why we're here today. How can we marry the growth required to help all of our countries prosper with the reality of the climate crisis? How do we make it part of business as usual without impeding on a company's ability to thrive and economically grow? And that's really what we want to take a dive into today. And we have representatives from all sides of the stakeholder value chain. We have finance represented, development represented, the consultants and the people actually designing the buildings as well. So really, we're going to take a look at all of the different elements, how they come together, and understand how we can get everybody involved and see why sustainability makes business sense and is truly the only pathway forward for anyone involved in the sector, regardless of their level of involvement. So let's start with Gordon. Could you please share with us a little bit about what role sustainability plays for GMR Group as a whole?
Sure, Eleni, thank you. Look, it's obviously a very important element of GMR across the different areas of GMR, and as you're aware, GMR covers off infrastructure and airports, and also property development. And sustainability is definitely embedded across all of those areas. To give you an idea, just on the airport side, earlier this year, Delhi Airport became 100% operating on renewable energy, in the sense that 94% is coming from hydroelectric energy and 6% from distributed solar generated energy. And the airport itself actually has a goal by 2030 to be carbon neutral on emissions, so by 2030. So it's very much an important part of GMR. The Smart Cities program we're doing across Delhi Airport in particular, sustainability is one of the prime components. So it's an essential piece.
And you're very involved, obviously, with the airports, but also with a smart city element. So maybe you can tell us a little bit more about, where does sustainability and smart cities meet? Are they one of the same, or is sustainability increasingly becoming something that is being more focused in the smart city lens?
I've been doing this so long, Eleni, that actually when I was in charge of Masdar City in Abu Dhabi, it was a green city. And we actually had some consultants and we had a lot of 500 plus, but IBM wet their teeth there and then came up with the concept of smart cities, working on our project. And before long, green cities disappeared and everything became a smart city. To answer your question with that as a pretext, I would argue that sustainability is embodied within smart. Smart has got a slightly different twist. There's no question, but the economic angle of sustainability, and as we know, sustainability has the three components. Smart is very much pays homage to sustainability. It may not always have the social angle that sustainability has as part of it, but I would argue that they're inexorably interlinked.
I feel like we can dive into this a lot more, but I will pause on you and come back to the smart city component and maybe pass on to Mr. Rao. So you have more of the role of the architect, principal consultant. So you're working with clients on a daily basis on a variety of different infrastructure projects. From where you're sitting, the concept of sustainability, which of course is not new, but has definitely been gathering steam over the last few years, I would say, and really the last couple of years in terms of perhaps importance. What have you witnessed in terms of client journeys and companies? Why are people, first of all, are clients coming to you and asking for sustainability? And if they are, what are their drivers? What are the key sticking points, and why are these conversations starting to happen?
Well, thank you, Elaine. Eleni, for that question. It's a very broad question. I'll try to, give a short answer. Um, well, to pick up on where Gordon left, I've been at this for a very long time. The word sustainability itself, started at least when I was doing my bachelor's thesis. It was called energy conservation, and that sort of transformed into sustainability. So it depends on who you ask, um, um, whether companies come to us asking for sustainability. They don't ask for sustainability, but it's really about the project, right? And it has changed over the last 30 years that I have been involved with, the term. Um, there are probably the first factor is market, and a public awareness, right? And in democratic societies, public awareness means it shapes public policy. So it leads to public policy, what you're required by law. That's another driver. These two are very practical drivers because, market and public awareness shape what people want to deliver to the market. Now, the third is certainly profitability, because it's real estate is, the numbers need to work. The fourth thing in my mind or in my experience is, just the corporate philosophy of the, people that you're working for. And that is the one single thing that has probably we have seen greater awareness in that area. There is greater commitment. People know you don't have to actually educate. It's probably the nuances that what does sustainability mean? What does smart city mean? That's how do we actually get there? That has people, there is greater awareness. So just to summarize, market awareness and public policy are very, very important. So that's why we work in different market areas, different countries. So working in California is very different than, say, working in the Middle East or working in China and, India. So, but core philosophy, corporate philosophy is a very, very important driver that can actually encourage innovation, new ideas, and risk tolerance. If the leadership has that vision, a lot can happen.
Absolutely, absolutely. And how much do you find that that corporate mindset is still in, let's call it the first movers? So is it still is it still the companies that are considered the pioneers of their particular markets? And you mentioned, of course, California, which is a highly progressive environmental state, but there are pockets around the world. Is the corporate mindset linked to people being pioneers, or is the corporate mindset now completely separate and actually it's becoming more mainstream that this is something companies are just committing to and doing?
A little bit of both, I think. It's hard to sort of disengage, the two. Corporate mindset is 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 certainly reflective of public awareness and what the people want. Absolutely. And it takes time for people's awareness to become public policy. But the pioneers are the ones who listen to what the people want before it becomes policy. And they become usually leaders in the market. They have a grander vision, and it's always hard. I'm sort of we are talking in generalities, of course. It depends on what kind of project we are talking about, but in principle, that is perhaps true. So we've had to convince our clients in China much more, let's say, than working in California, for example. So and that has also changed over time.
Definitely. I mean, this is resonating a lot. We work globally and we definitely see there are some markets where people are saying we want to get into this, but we'll only do it if we're the first. because we want to
Yeah.
have that full first mover advantage and gain the benefit of marketing and the leadership. And then you have other markets where it's exactly you're being kind of pulled by the legislation, by the market demand, and that has changed so much. Autif, I'm
Yeah.
curious from your experience with IFC and working with the Green Building Transformation Program across Southeast Asia. Have you seen something similar in terms of the awareness and also sort of who are the companies that are actually driving change in that particular region?
Sure. So, being an architect myself, I know that the architecture community was kind of at the forefront on the awareness side, at least. Uh, they knew what uh, the impact buildings could have on the environment, and there have been efforts for a long time on improving the building stock so it has lower impact, lower. Even though the word climate change or the phrase climate change was not really used, but energy efficiency, as Srinivas was saying, was one of those things that was in the mainstream for a long time. What I'm really seeing change in the last even 5 years, I would say, are the financial institutions, the investors, the local banks getting really interested in this space. And I there are multiple reasons for that. There are obviously regulatory reasons. Like in India, the RBI, Reserve Bank of India, is tightening the screws a little bit. You can say they are putting through some regulations that initially require reporting, disclosure on carbon, on green investments. And gradually over time, I feel they will be mandating a certain percentage of the investments to go for climate projects only, which is what many global investors are already doing. Uh, our own investment team, so being part of the World Bank Group, we have certain targets on investments, which have been continuously growing over the years. So used to be 20%, now it's close to 35%, and I believe it will keep growing. I believe this is happening not just because somebody's mandating it, but because these investors are seeing that there is profit in sustainability. There is benefit that they can derive uh, because the regulations are getting stricter. The the buildings that are not or the assets that are not really climate friendly are going to be more distressed later. The ones that are following the norms, that are really keeping up to the times, will be better, more valuable assets going forward. So that level of change is really welcome, and I think that is bringing about a host of other changes in developers who now see more access to green finance, and obviously the demand has to be bottom driven by the consumer. That's also happening with the newer generation being more aware of sustainability, environmental aspects of construction. So the trend is in the positive side. It's just the speed of that change which is concerning me, because climate change is happening at such a drastic pace. We are all seen. I'm sure every one of us has experienced what the drastic impact sudden climate variation can bring about. Just today, we heard in Bangalore that it got major flooding within like 2, 3 weeks of flooding that happened recently, and this was kind of unusual for that city. And Europe has faced heat waves and so many other unusual weather patterns. That is changing much faster than the pace at which we, as investors, as companies, building buildings, designing buildings, operating buildings, are changing. So it's just that the pace needs to be speeded up.
Absolutely. And I think, well, hopefully, if we can, by the end of this webinar, have convinced everybody watching that every building should be a green building, I think we'll have achieved our 1 hour of value for the world. But I think that's kind of the crux of it, right? It's we know this needs to happen. There's obviously a massive driver, and something that you mentioned, Autif, is that, and Srinivas, is ultimately that we're not just saying that real estate needs to be sustainable for the sake of being sustainable or because it's the right thing to do, which, by the way, it is, and we shouldn't underestimate the actual value to the planet. but there are actually tangible business benefits. And I think that's really what I want to hone in on today is, we're talking about something that is a business decision. And ultimately, anybody who's watching this webinar and needs to go to their board, to their CFO, to their CEO, whoever, to make a decision, it does need to have data, it needs to have justification, and it needs to have a clear understanding of why should they make this particular real estate development, this city, this urban development green, right? So let's hone in a little bit on the finance, and then we'll touch back on a couple of points that Gordon and Srinivas mentioned. But Watif, tell us a little bit more on the finance side. So you mentioned obviously banks are paying attention. There's a lot more movement in the investment side. Are they setting requirements? Are there better interest rates? Are there new sources of financing that people can access? Like, what is the actual benefit from someone who wants to go out and develop a project from the banking side? What are the is it an incentive, or is it actually the opposite and it's punishment, let's say, for not being green?
It's a combination of all of those. So in certain cases where the market is more difficult to move, there have been certain incentives, especially since the Paris Climate Accord, when the global community, the countries committed to putting together some climate funds, even though those commitments have not been fully realized, but still a huge amount of climate fund has been raised. And from what I understand, a lot of those funds are not finding enough suitable projects in the building sector, in the real estate sector, in the developing countries like India. And if those projects are out there, some of them can actually get better interest rates, or some other kind of benefits like lower loan to value ratio, maybe more access to finance, lower eligibility criteria. And even at the smaller scale, we are seeing that, like you and I have been working on this project with a housing finance company. And this housing finance company is providing loans to people building their own houses, small individual houses, middle low income, and sometimes even like they don't really have a bank account sometimes. And we are trying to help them meet green standards. If they just go to a regular bank, they may not even able to get a loan, a home loan. But because they are committing to a green home loan, they have better chances of accessing that money. And because it's a green home loan, the home would be more efficient. The chances are that they'll be able to save more money on a monthly basis and repay the loan. So the bank also benefits because the default rates go down. And this has been seen in other countries as well. So there are multiple benefits that I see for the larger banks. They are getting into this because they also have to raise investments from somewhere. So if they are doing more climate investments, it becomes more possible to get climate finance for their own operations. And we have some banks which have just said we'll only do climate investments now because that's the most profitable business we can do.
So really multiple layers of all the way from the bottom of the end consumer needing finance to be able to do something as important as having a home, all the way through to banks trying to raise money from other banks and trying to get financing in. There's obviously a huge trickle effect. And we talked a little bit about policy before, and I kind of want to touch on that as well. And I'm curious, Gordon and Srinivas, kind of how you've seen from your experience, what comes first in terms of the impact for a market? Are we seeing policy coming first, and then we're seeing the green smart cities being developed, the green airports, the sustainable infrastructure projects, or are you seeing that companies still need to take that first step and show what's possible, and then policy follows for the rest? Kind of what have you seen in your experience globally? Gordon, maybe you first, and then I'll come to Srinivas.
Yeah, it's an interesting question. It's policy. In fact, I'd written down what Srinivas said earlier because I love things with P's, and he made me write down philosophy, profit, and policy. as three of the drivers, and then I added another one, which was people, because people drive policy ultimately. So to your point about policy, everything is a mixture of top down, bottom up, and or aspirational projects. So a lot of the time, the changes that we need to see that have always happened and have been happening in sustainability have come from the people who've then informed in democratic societies policy changes that are in line with that. And I'm sure Srinivas knows the famous case of air conditioning standards in California in the 1970s, which is such a lovely old story, but it's a great story, and it still continues to this day in that sense. Having said that, there is also, I would argue, a place for iconic and or aspirational developments, and I've managed to work on a few of those around the world. And sometimes in certain jurisdictions, you do need to sort of do something iconic, which is the best practice, best case example, to sort of show the people who are not seeing it firsthand what can be done. And in fact, a couple of those projects had the IFC involved as well here and there. So there is certainly a movement in certain countries to do that. I would argue in the more developed world, the policy is very much pushed by the people. I was working in Norway a couple of years ago, and at the government level, both federally and in a municipal level, the people are completely driving green, which then comes into policy. And at that point, then the developers and everyone who's playing in that market, they have to play by those rules. And honestly, at times, developers do need stringent policy because of the philosophy and the profit element that Srinivas was referring to. And whilst there are many green developers, and there is actually a Green Property Developers Index that's been around for a number of years, many developers want brand association with green. Many developers also still need a bit of a hit in the head with a policy stick that may behave in the way that society wants them to behave.
Absolutely. It's trying to get that curve right, and ultimately getting to the point that there is the point of no return, which is when everything is mandatory. Srinivas, I'm curious to hear your experience as well, kind of on this topic of policy, and also your thoughts on the fourth P of your pillars.
Yeah, I think, I agree with what Gordon said, and it's usually a few, a new idea, public awareness, and some pioneering work that certainly starts it all and gets converted to public policy. What public policy does is takes a good idea that works and makes it the law so that everybody follows it. So it actually makes it mainstream. So public policy is a very important tool. So you don't rely on just the outliers, but make it mainstream. So having said that, I just want to share a story, regarding public policy. And when we were doing a lot of work in China, developers were not interested in sustainability per se, because they would build and sell whatever they built. So they had no interest or no drive to see how the building operates, what the cost of operation and maintenance is. So the Chinese government realized that, and they changed the policy. I don't remember, it was 2007, 8 maybe. I may be getting my years wrong, but they were required to hold a certain percentage of property. So they became, so suddenly operation and maintenance became a part of their problem. So we didn't actually have to, then so a developer who was actually doing a project under the new policy, we actually demonstrated how just changing the skin of the building from just curtain wall to putting some, shading devices, annually the amount of real estate they had, how much energy costs they would save. So, there are those kind of, pardon me, my phones keep slipping up. So those kind of extreme examples where, but they demonstrate the power of public policy.
Absolutely, absolutely. And also, I think you're also touching on an important element, which is the accountability and ownership element of real estate assets, which certainly it's very different when you're developing something to sell versus you're an owner occupier of the building. That being said, a sustainable real estate asset does have benefits whether you are selling it or not, right? So I'm curious, have you worked on any specific projects with clients where you've seen benefits being realized even when a client is ultimately going to sell the asset separate from policy?
Absolutely. And again, that really, even I'll just take China as an example, because and why I'm using China as an example is because in a span of whatever 10 to 20 years, there was a huge amount of nation building that happened. So it provides a good sort of ground to understand some social experiments, as far as real estate is concerned. So yes, in fact, the awareness and willingness to openness to ideas was greater always in Shanghai, for example, as compared to other parts. It really depends where you are. The bigger entities, developers will be more aware of what's going on, and their international clientele who would be occupying some of the spaces that they are creating. So it certainly is eventually who they are catering to. So if your clientele are looking for that, the developer would respond to that market. So while I always believe that sustainability should start, you alluded to that earlier, is that we might do metrics, we might do, why sustainability, but bottom line, because it's the right thing to do. But how do we actually transform that to convince, private entities, governmental organizations? Yes, they are on board already in most places, but private developers, larger corporate developers, and smaller developers in a place like India, that's also an important. So, but I'm going to be sort of deviating from the topic, so I'll pause at that point.
I'm curious, maybe also if you can jump in from some of your experience working in India specifically as well, and some of the work that IFC has done in terms of quantifying the benefits for developers. Do you have any examples or any specific tangible reasons, really, why it does make sense for developers to do this?
Yeah. So my feeling after working in this field for some time is that the biggest challenge is that we are not able to communicate the business case for green to the various stakeholders, whether it's the government, whether it's the private developers, the investors, or the end buyers, the end consumers. And if we do a proper job in communicating and connecting to their pain points, saying that this is one way we can actually relieve some of that pain, whatever that pain may be, whether it's finance, whether it's the ability to have a more comfortable space, a more livable space, better infrastructure. So one example that I can relate here is an affordable housing developer in Vietnam. They partnered with us on our EDGE Green Building certification, and they were also going to sell all their apartments. So the question is, why would they do it? So we said, let's try it out. Let's do a communication campaign for your prospective buyers to highlight these green benefits in a way that they can understand without making it like a big marketing pitch, without really running very glitzy ads. We just put together some what they call open houses or sales galleries, where people could come and not just see a model house, but also go through the whole process of how these green elements were incorporated, why they were incorporated, what do they look like, how different are they as compared to a regular material, a regular equipment that's used in houses, and the benefits, the savings they would get, the more comfort they would get, etc., etc. And we realized this simple messaging actually worked so much better than the conventional marketing and advertising. This developer was able to sell off their entire building stock, all their apartments, in one third the time they took on their other properties that did not have this approach. So, and we've tried this in a few other projects as well. I think this is definitely a thing that we'll keep replicating, and I hope others do too.
Absolutely. And I think the ability to sell is a huge driver in terms of integrating sustainability, specifically as we're getting more and more sustainable procurement requirements, more companies looking for office spaces that are green and that are healthy and energy efficient, and especially cost of energy as well is now top of mind. I think energy efficiency is going to be ringing alarm bells for anyone looking to rent or buy space. Now, so we've talked about benefits in terms of the ability to potentially access finance. We've talked about ultimately the legislation being a driver, about the ability to sell. Of course, we've covered a little bit in terms of if you're owning the property, the actual operations of the building and the ability to reduce your O&M costs. What about risks? Because I think to kind of build on your point, Autif, oftentimes when we're looking at, why should we be building green buildings? Why should we be integrating sustainability into real estate? We're always trying to find what that added benefit is, but we're often not looking at what happens if you don't do this. What are the actual risks to the business? Because the reality is a building is going to be there for 50 years, 100 years, I hope 100 years, but it's something that is a long-term investment. So maybe Gordon, we'll start with you and we'll go around the virtual room. In terms of, from your experience, from your perspective, are there tangible risks to businesses that aren't integrating sustainability, and kind of what have you seen in your experience, or what do you think people should be considering?
I think you've actually heard the flip side of the risks actually in some of the previous comments, first of all, and I'll come to that. But I'll just pick you up on your 50, 60 years. One of the problems with developers is they don't think 50, 60 years because properties are valued for balance sheets often on a 10-year discounted cash flow. So as much as we want to think that they see the long term, and we have life cycle estimates, and I'm sure Srinivas's company is very good at preparing, all the life cycle for the various high value components that go into the different projects, and that's all good and has to be done. And there is no question that we've got the benefits of the savings, of efficiencies, etc., which are going to accrue in the short term. But I'm just going to pick you up on the market doesn't really think 50, 60 years out, unfortunately, in many cases, unless the philosophy, back to the Srinivas's point, the philosophy of the company is that, okay, no, we are in this for the long term, and we're going to ignore the 10-year DCF. We're just going to make sure that we keep doing things right. So, but to the risk point, I think Autif actually brought up a wonderful example. When you do a DCF on a property, when you're doing a feasibility on your own property as a developer, if you can sell off your apartments in 1/3 of the time, that goes to your bottom line in a big way, because developers work on tiny margins. The project might cost a huge amount of money, but they're sort of working, they leverage debt to equity in such a way that their amount of money is actually very small. And if they can sell the apartments in 1/3 of the time, that's huge. So the risk for them is they're leaving money on the table. Similarly, if they don't put the energy saving shading in that Srinivas was referring to, they're also going to leave money on the table in the short term. And it's very easy for developers to sort of miss some of the basic stuff actually. And look, you've probably heard of the must-haves, nice-to-haves, and like-to-haves, which is a bit of a developer's mantra. There are many elements of sustainability which are must-haves. There's just no question. You know, you don't build a building without a building management system, and you don't, whether you call it a IBMS for an intelligent building management system or a BMS, it's going to be state of the art, it's going to be smart, and it's going to do the right job. Now, that used to be called a sustainable feature. If you put the I in front of it, it's sustainable. If you don't put the I in front of it, it's not sustainable. But that's nonsense, because you're always going to have the I in front of it anyway, as in you're going to build a very smart, put in a smart building management system to run a building. So I think the risks are still there. Again, it varies from market to market. It's whether they philosophically put the sustainability element into certain sustainability elements into must-have, versus pulling them out and saying, well, we don't really need this. Do we need it? Maybe, maybe not. Let's see how we're going. But bottom line is they do risk leaving money on the table if they don't examine it properly.
Which is a pretty significant risk and can become a very nice benefit if found. Srinivas, any other risks, or do you agree with Gordon on this?
No, I think Gordon pretty much covered it. The only thing I would add is, as awareness grows and sustainability practices become the norm, which they are, companies that do not evolve with times will become irrelevant. It's a risk that, because real estate is it's a business that involves time. Large projects take they have long gestation periods, getting approvals and getting built. And within a period of 5-10 years, where big large projects are actually built in sort of incremental phases, if you do not have vision, and if you haven't invested, if you don't know where the world is going and what the problems of the next generation for whom you're building, if you do not have the ability to anticipate that, you will become irrelevant. And the project is, there are others who would actually provide that insight and better buildings and better places for people to live in. And just one more thing I want to add is, because it's important to say this, when we talk about this, people may get the sense that these apply unconditionally to every place, every society. And it's actually not true. In principle, they do, but sustainability may be different for different society, because one of the important aspects of sustainability is being responsive to the patterns of how they lead their lives. The cities have to reflect that, rather than superimposing ideas that do not actually match with how people lead their lives. And sometimes we see that. We see that in gated communities, for example, that continue to be built, right? So there are layers and layers. One of the important things is it's not just about buildings. It's about urban planning. It's about planning zoning codes. It's about urban design. All of that. Green buildings come right at the end, because many of the things have already been set by the time buildings are designed. So I just wanted to underline that.
Absolutely. And I think I'm curious, Gordon, from your experience and sort of like the smart city lens and kind of working globally, if that's also, if you zoom out from the green building, if it's exactly kind of that approach of taking it more holistically and kind of setting out the infrastructure in place to enable then on an asset by asset level, green buildings to be able to thrive.
Yeah, you're right. And it's an interesting point in that buildings are at the end of the infrastructure journey in a sense. And yet, and you're right, because property developers are very, very much plot developers. They like to be in control of a little piece of delineated land and do what they're allowed to do under the planning code. And so in that sense, yeah, they are at the end of the tunnel, of the sense that you've had all the transport put in place, you've had infrastructure put in place, et cetera, et cetera. But the irony is, the outcome of that means, though, that the value of real estate in any city is something in excess of 80% of the asset value of the city. I used to have that figure, and I've lost the damn figure. Forgive me for exactly where it came from, but I learned it so many years ago, and it just resonated, which is fascinating. So you put in place all of those other infrastructure assets, and yet the real estate value, and this is obviously commercial value in real estate, is so massively dwarfs the value of all of the other infrastructure. So infrastructure lives to support and create the real estate environment. So
super interesting. That's yeah, food for thought. I feel like we're having a lot of nuggets in this. So I'm hoping our audience is enjoying this. I am getting a couple of questions, so I'm going to divert from our conversation a little bit to just pull in the audience. So one of the questions that we've gotten from our audience is they're really interested in this conversation, particularly mentioning also the residential component of going green. And they ask, the challenge remains that the homes are sold around capex and profit and bought mostly on margin money and the home loans and not on life cycle cost. So how do we actually change that narrative, and how do we change that, particularly for the residential developments? Autif, maybe start with you, as you've been quite closely on the residential side.
Yeah, I think that firstly, that information that was mentioned in that comment about life cycle analysis, that seems like such a big, heavy word or heavy phrase. But in reality, that's not rocket science. That information can be shared and conveyed quite easily. In fact, if, the software that we have developed, the Edge software, allows you to do a very quick assessment of your cost and benefit for different green measures. So it doesn't say that you only have to follow this path to achieve sustainability. There's so many different ways to get there. And your choice can be dependent on the budget that you have. You don't necessarily need to exceed your budget by a lot. Sometimes even don't need to exceed the budget at all and still get there and achieve the sustainability and the efficiency that you want. The other thing, the other aspect of this is, which is what we can call a risk, is that the tariffs are changing. I'm talking about electricity tariffs, water tariffs. The temperatures are fluctuating. The gap between demand and supply for our natural resources, that's increasing. And that means now our buildings are more susceptible to, and I'm talking especially in developing countries like India, they're more susceptible to power cuts. They're more susceptible to water shortages. So when that happens, what will you do? Will we be able to continue buildings like airport terminals? How do we do that? Do we switch to diesel generators? Or if we can design this with this scenario in mind right from the beginning and put in systems that firstly reduce the demand for these resources. We don't need as much electricity if we have good passive design. We don't need huge chillers by intelligently designing our passive systems. Similarly, lighting, water systems as well can be downsized so that as and when these things happen, these climate events happen, we are ready for it. We don't have to pay a lot to get tanker water like many projects are doing in Bangalore and Chennai when the droughts happen, when the water scarcity happens. So there is that risk as well that we should be aware of.
Absolutely. And I know you mentioned developing countries, but honestly, I mean, in Greece and the UK, we're also talking about power cuts this year. With the cost of energy, it's becoming a real thing in the developed world as well. And I think resilience and really making assets that are able to withstand an extreme situation, whether that's physical weather or whether it's just a changing society, is super, super important. That kind of ties into one of the questions we've had from the audience as well, is around the impact of COVID and how designs have changed, and how an extreme phenomenon, let's call it, of a global pandemic has influenced the design and also the willingness of companies to think differently about design. Maybe Srinivas, you can cover this a little bit.
That's a very broad question. I think there has been, specifically relating to COVID, it depends on what kind of buildings, of course. I'm assuming public buildings, airport terminals, for example. So the space requirements, obviously are different. But, the world is slowly coming back to where it was, because we cannot just build new terminals to accommodate 6-foot spacing between people, right? So it's an evolving, it's an interesting lesson. We think about it when we are designing it. Whether we have all the solutions, I'm not so sure. So it's an evolving topic. We haven't designed any buildings. Yes, for example, HVAC, greater air changes, things like that. But other
has
than
there
that,
been a link to sustainability as well, or has it mostly been just like the air and the space and
no, I think it's mostly pandemic related, at least in my experience. Sustainability has always been in the conversation, so that doesn't mean that has left the room. So it continues to exist. So yeah.
Gordon or Tiff, have you seen any changes in terms of how people are speaking about sustainability since COVID, or if COVID impacted any conversations or even financing? We've got another question about whether financial institutions changed the way that they lend to green buildings kind of post-COVID, or if there was an increased emphasis on green buildings due to the pandemic as well.
I think there has been some improved awareness of indoor comfort, indoor quality. Now engineers, architects are paying more attention to ventilation rates, which was not the case earlier. However, that is also causing a conflict or kind of a tussle with energy efficiency, because if you're pulling more air through, then you are increasing the energy consumption of the building. There are obviously technical solutions to that, and there are some really nice ones. One good example that comes to my mind is this hospital in Singapore, which is relying on mixed mode for cooling, which means that whenever the temperature outside is nice, their air conditioner turns off, and there are openable windows, even in like patient rooms, ample windows to bring in light and ventilation, with plants right outside the windows, so it doesn't really bring the noise and the dust. And they've actually found that the patient recovery rates in those rooms with ventilation was better than other wards in the same hospital that were not naturally ventilated. So in a way, we are going back to our roots in some way, connecting more with nature, which is a great thing. I hope these kind of things can be explored further by architects like Srinivas.
I think it's an interesting. Oh, sorry, go on, Gordon.
I'd just love to comment on Otif's observation. I used to live in Singapore, but one of the optional components when we were developing Masdar City was in fact automated window openers based on air quality sensors mixed in, which obviously then had to work in conjunction with the entire HVAC systems, because you just because the air's hit the right temperature and hit the right air quality, there's a lot of stuff going on there. But that was actually something that was on our sustainability nice to have list, not our must to have list, and it actually never went ahead because we couldn't squeeze it into the budget, and we couldn't get the evidence to show that it would actually save enough money in the development going forward So it's fascinating.
Yeah, that's probably because Abu Dhabi is such an extreme climate.
Yeah.
Singapore is much milder, and there are numerous times of the year when the outside temperature is really nice. You don't need air conditioning.
I lived in Singapore for 10 years. I would argue you do need air conditioning
Just a
quite
little bit of
often, actually.
humidity.
Yes, just a little bit, but yeah, yes, you can still live without it, and there's no question. A lot of the old Singapore HDB passive design elements manage people for living for years without air conditioning properly. So it can be done, but it's also nice to have it there as well.
Well, and I think sometimes when we think about green buildings, we think about sustainable real estate, we think PV panels immediately or some particular, fancy tech, but sometimes some of the solutions are really just simple passive design features or quite things that don't necessarily come top of mind when we're thinking about sustainability. And it is quite important to understand the range of everything that can be done in real estate, and that it is a spectrum and doesn't have to be the newest technology, although of course the newest technology can be fantastic as well, and it is very market dependent. I think we've had an interesting conversation today, kind of ranging from different countries and jumping into specific examples, and to Srinivas's point, every context is different, and there's no one size fits all solution that does make sense, but there is a list of, call it 50 options that exist, 100 options for real estate that can be implemented in a combination of different ways. Srinivasa, do you want to come in?
Yeah. So, as I was hearing this conversation, an example came to my mind, which I had used, in the early 90s. I published a paper on sustainability. Sustainability, like you said, sometimes it's actually very simple. It's not using some great technology. And the extreme example that I had in mind was, it doesn't make sense to put solar panels on the roof, convert it to electricity to run your dryer if you have space to dry your clothes in the sun. So, so many times sustainability is actually a very common thing. It's sometimes, and many times, it's just undoing the bad habits that we have gathered over time. And I call that the high cost of comfort that we have lived, we have actually got used to. So comfort is also a very relative term. So I just wanted to add that.
I think that's a great point. And maybe ties into, I'll take one more question and then I'll ask the panel to share some closing thoughts. But we have a lot of good conversations, but the CapEx, pitching the CapEx is really the hardest part, because obviously it tends to be a little bit higher when we're looking at investing in green. So what approaches can we take where cost reductions can happen? How can we make investors and people that we're pitching for sustainability in real estate more accustomed to the fact that that initial cost might need to be a little bit higher? I don't know who wants to take this one.
Maybe I can take the first stab at it. So that is a very common perception, and there have been numerous surveys and studies to show that yes, in some cases it can be very high, the initial cost of green or sustainability, but it typically happens when it is an add-on. It is not an integrated part of the process. If you start upfront with sustainability as one of the key criteria, just like we do for structural design, for mechanical design, electrical design, if you start sustainability right from the beginning, then it doesn't have to be that expensive. In numerous cases, we found that good passive design has helped reduce the cost of active design measures. So you save money. One good example is curtain walls. I think Srinivas mentioned that in the beginning. There's a nice building in Bangalore facing golf course. Very nice, beautiful building, but full of curtain wall, full of glass, facing west. So they face extreme heat, and they designed it to get the view of the golf course. Now all the blinds are down all the time, and they spend a lot on air conditioning. So if we design well, we can avoid those situations. We can reduce the cost, of these kind of fancy things that don't really fit into our climate, like curtain walls in most cases. We can reduce the cost of the cooling systems. We can reduce the cost of the ventilation systems, sometimes even lighting systems and water systems, and utilize that saving in something that can provide us even better impact. So if we follow that kind of hierarchy of design decision making, our experiences, the cost can be limited to like 2 to 3% at the most.
Gordon, Srinivas, anything else to add on this?
Yeah, no, I'd agree with that totally. It does highlight the fact that the good design trumps everything. There's just no question. And as Autif said, I would slightly disagree on the some active measures, can be beneficial, but so the main thrust of what he was saying, it's all about design.
Definitely. So Srinivas and his team have a lot of work to do in terms of designing fantastic, sustainable buildings around the world.
So, I want to add one line to that, what has already been said. It's a motto that we follow. Good design takes this exact same amount of effort as bad design. So why not do good design?
Very good sentence to to wrap up. I think we've covered a lot. Hopefully, we've really shown kind of the different nuances of sustainability in real estate, and we've kind of looked at the philosophy and the commitment of what it takes. Some of the benefits, the cost benefits, are really the profit and the ability to gain money, find hidden money or money left on the table. The ability to integrate it from the beginning. So really thinking about it and getting all of that, some of the risks, the physical risks, the risks of changing legislation, some of the customer demands. So really quite a lot within sustainability in real estate. But I do want to give our panelists one last chance to share some closing thoughts. Srinivas, I feel like you kind of shared a closing thought, but feel free to share another closing thought if you want to. But maybe I'll start with Gordon. Any closing thoughts for our topic today?
Not a lot, other than because I think it all came out rather well. But the bottom line is you've got to embed sustainability across everything you do, to the point where then, as Autif kind of said, it almost becomes invisible. You shouldn't even have a column in your spreadsheet that says this is the cost of sustainability. It should just be part of it.
Absolutely. Srinivas, anything else to add?
I think we have covered everything. If I were to think of one more thing to add, is to emphasize sustainability is also, it's not a bunch of solutions that other people have done, but it starts with the ability to listen to the forces that are at play, the people that you're designing for, the land that you're dealing with, because sometimes the solutions are very, very simple. As an example, in India, for example, much of the stock is apartment buildings, for example, that are built, reinforced concrete structure, brick CMU walls, windows, many times for a long time, it's single pane windows, no insulation. So imagine a very simple act of adding insulation to all the new buildings that are built in India. That will make a huge difference. So sometimes it's very simple, I would like to underline the word simple measures and being able to listen.
Absolutely.
Thanks.
Autif?
Yeah, reiterating what was discussed earlier, that sustainability can and will lead to profitability. But for that, we need to firstly communicate better, be as simple as possible, and collaborate better. So collaborate with basically all the entities. We cannot work in silos anymore. We need to work with the designers, the owners, the operators, investors, and lastly, the government as well. We all have to do it. But even if one of them is not really playing along, let's not wait for them to catch up. Let's just move along.
Absolutely. The time to do it is now, and hopefully you are all as inspired as I am after this great conversation to get involved. Thank you to our amazing panel for such a great conversation and for joining from all different time zones. We hope this has been very, very productive and hope you have a good morning, afternoon, or evening, depending on where you are. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.